2022 was Toys for Tots' 75th anniversary and also their record-breaking year, distributing over 24 million toys to nearly 10 million less fortunate children. Toys for Tots is not just a Christmas time charity, they're a year-round force for good. Thanks to their supporters, Toys for Tots is able to support children in need beyond Christmas time through their year-round programs. You can make a difference today. Learn more about their year-round force for good at toysfortots.org.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Today we'll start off with a quote from our friends at Wikipedia. Truthiness is the belief or assertion that a particular statement is true based on the intuition or perceptions of some individual or individuals, without regard to evidence, logic, intellectual examination, or facts. Truthiness can range from ignorant assertions of falsehoods to deliberate duplicity or propaganda intended to sway opinions. From a political perspective, we live in a world that is pretty complex to navigate. Those in positions of power want those without power to believe whatever narrative they are fed. This is a historic truth that we cannot run away from, no matter how hard we try. There is a universal objective reality in how power equations are managed within and between societies, organizations, and communities. There are those who lead and those who follow. However, in today's age, where reporting the news is now in the hands of fewer and fewer media megacorporations, how do we get to the truth of the matter? Heads of such organizations are not only powerful, they are extremely wealthy and influential, which puts them close to the top of the power pyramid. Couple this to the fact that there are political figures out there who ingratiate themselves to global media barons and their acolytes, seeing it in their interest to manipulate the news cycle for their betterment. A certain US president comes to mind. Nonetheless, when reporting on international events, who are we meant to believe? The big media moguls or the little guy on social media? Social media itself is replete with alternative facts. Screaming headlines dripping in ideological or pathological goo. But for the average Joe citizen, many working a number of jobs and maintaining a family, who has the time to fact check? In the end, if we, the consumer of mainstream and social media, are too tired or too apathetic to check the sources, can we even care about the truth? What about those at the coalface of the media, the reporters? Surely we can trust them to cut through the guff. Unfortunately, on this episode of Strategicon, we experienced what we can only describe as the 4G network interfering with our audio. Perhaps on a later episode we might discuss the ramifications of 5G politically and also try and avoid them from the audio perspective. Please be patient with the episode as the first 5 minutes contains what can only be described as irritating crackles. Today we are joined by Dr. Sharon Mascall-Dare. Sharon is Adjunct Associate Professor at the University of South Australia, School of Creative Industries. She was also a freelance producer and reporter for BBC World Service. We are also joined today by multi-award-winning journalist and author on cyber and technology issues, who is also SIA Senior Associate from the UK, Peter Warren. Welcome, Peter.
Hello.
Welcome, Sharon.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, if I can throw the first question over to Sharon. As a former working journalist for arguably one of the biggest and most reputable sources of news in the world, the BBC, what are your observations regarding the media generally and reporting for the media in particular?
Oh, well, there's no question, John. I mean, it's changed beyond recognition. I mean, when I started my career 30 years ago now, for a start, there was no internet. I remember literally having to telephone the local cop shop endlessly in the run-up to the hour, just in case there'd been some sort of last-minute crime they were prepared to put onto their press line. Everything was done by telephone and by just getting out there, getting out and about, getting your boots dirty and getting the story. And the other thing that was crucial at that time was just the lengths that we went to fact check. and to triple source every story that we ran. I mean, it was standard practice in any BBC newsroom that you would have 3 independent sources to verify anything before you put it out on air. And that was stuck to, absolutely adhered to. And of course, in the last 30 years, that's changed beyond recognition in that, I mean, certainly I know through my own work as a lecturer teaching in Southeast Asia and also here in Australia teaching journalism as a working journalist myself. I mean, the pressures now in terms of the race to meet deadlines, that 24-hour news cycle, the fact that, social media can beat you to running the story and get the scoop. The fact that triple sourcing, it's just not done. It is not done. And as a result, we have a significant problem with the reliability and the truth of what we're now viewing, hearing and reading.
Pete, what can you add to that?
Well, I've worked for the Sunday Times Insight team. We do still triple source. I mean, I have been working for the Sunday Times Insight team this year. Yes, as Sharon says, the issue is that if you're working on breaking news as opposed to investigative journalism, then you are up against social media sites. One of the other things is, it's also triple source, but sources of veracity, because you can quite easily triple source using the web, but you don't know whether the website that you're picking the information up from is a trustworthy and reliable source.
David?
I suppose 2 things come out of that I'm interested in is, one, trying to do veracity 20 years ago on 3 sources, I'm assuming would have been difficult because there was a lot less information available easily 20 years ago. So that would have slowed the pace. But now, as you said, Pete, the sheer amount of information becomes a problem. So is this going to mean that in the long run, social media will be how breaking news works, and it will almost always be without veracity, and it will only be long-form investigative journalism that can actually meet these high standards of I trust the source because they take the time to get it right?
I think that's true. And I mean, I think that's what you're seeing at the moment. The Cairncross review in the UK has been suggesting that there is a need to find some form of funding for high quality journalism, because there needs to be some source that people can go to where they can actually say, yeah, we trust that source. We know that source is good.
And that's what we're really seeing here in Australia with Schwartz Media, where they're more and more packaging slow news. They're doing a newspaper once a week. They're going to do a news podcast once a day to make the point they can't put that much product out, but the product they put out will have a very high level of credibility.
But I'd like to question the idea that years ago that there was less veracity around. I
don't think there was less, but I think it would have been very hard with limited information. So you needed time with less information. Is that a fair assumption?
I suppose the thing that I wanted to question is the fact that the sources that we had that were available to us as journalists, they were much more established, and it was essentially you had these kind of hubs of information that were deemed to be reliable. So in terms of
sources were credible, so you had 3 credible ones you could go to quite quickly.
Yes. So for example, I mean, the standard ones we'd go to, in a BBC newsroom is that we would go to Reuters, then one other news agency, and then go to our own correspondent on the ground. And that was seen to be then the triple sourcing principle had been adhered to, and those 3 sources were deemed to be reliable. Because
everyone was meeting that basic standard of doing the same thing. So it was somewhat of an echo chamber, but it was an echo chamber holding itself to account.
To an extent, but to jump in there and to support Sharon, you would you would have a source from the police. You say you were doing a story about something that was going wrong in a prison. You would go to a prison charity or somebody who was collecting a lot of information. They were a reputable source. They were people who had information and understanding at their fingertips. That was the way that it was traditionally done. Isn't that fair, Sharon?
Yes, I would agree with you there, Pete. And I think also what was important at that time was that in order to be in that position of being deemed a credible source, there was training that had gone with that. And it was seen, it it was seen arguably, and I know this is something we could argue, it was seen as a profession. So to work in public affairs, to work in journalism, to work in information dissemination, you had to have qualifications and training to perform that role. I mean, on the flip side, though, and this is something that I think is very interesting, and this is something that's come out certainly through my own academic research, is what was attached to that was some difficulties around the fact that information was then, there was close hold on it, and it was retained by particular, sometimes we could even regard them to be hegemonic organisations that were then clutching that information close, were not then open to allowing individual voices or dissenting narratives to come into the news arena. And so that's one of the reasons why I feel that social media has gone in the way it has to some extent, because that's been a platform and an opportunity for the little man or the little woman, the man in the street, woman in the street, to say, well, actually, I dissent. I feel that this is not the way that I'm experiencing this particular issue. I have a voice. I now want to use this platform to ensure that my voice and that my experience is also heard. But of course, the problem we've then got with that is it's become a slippery slope in that we now have this absolute explosion and cacophony of information with a lack of verification of those individual sources.
So by getting rid of the potential risk of hegemony, you destabilize the credibility. So it's always a balancing act between control of information and veracity of information.
Indeed.
And good journalists were trained to always think about balancing those two, whereas now it's a free-for-all.
Can I just ask a question? I'd like to find out what were the sanctions against journalists and media outlets for having deliberately or by just lazy journalism produced the wrong kind of information back in the day, as opposed to today, because we're going to be pushing the whole social media barrow a little bit later. But how did journalism control and check itself from its worst excesses?
Oh, that's there's, in fact, it's funny with the research I conducted for today's podcast. Remembered some classic examples of this. In that, indeed, certainly my experience of working with inside the BBC was that there was some very strong and continues to be some internal policing. There's one good example. I won't name names in terms of the correspondent, but I remember one case where there was she'd been covering a story which involved drug use in a city I won't name. And essentially, in order to create a greater sense of drama and some visuals to support that, she'd gone to a local pharmacy, bought a bunch of syringes and scattered them on the ground to give the sense of the location, being used by drug users. This was subsequently discovered, and that particular journalist was then disgraced and essentially was removed from her post and was not able to perform her role for some years. And then in time, once she'd then sort of done her time, she was then allowed back into the fold. So that's one example of where, there was an internal kind of checking system. That said, though, I'm also aware of, there's another fantastic example where I worked on a particular program where I remember that we did a documentary about a homeless lady who had essentially been living in Oxford. And the line that the program decided to take is that this homeless lady had managed to go to Oxford, the inference being the university. And there were lots of shots in this documentary about with her among the Oxford colleges, walking in and out of very grand doorways, going in and out of the Bodleian, the Great Library. And in fact, as I pointed out, having, studied there myself, she'd not studied actually at the university. She'd gone to Oxford Brookes University, as it used to be the Polytechnic. Now, Oxford Brookes has an excellent reputation in its own right, and I felt it was quite insulting in the documentary that we'd given the inference to our audience that she studied at the university and not Oxford Brookes. But for some reason, the people that I worked with said, look, and I was actually told, and no word of a lie, Sharon, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
That's an interesting point that you raised, Sharon, because some of the commercial current affairs programs here in Australia have been, dare I say, accused of gilding the lily to sex up a story. There is a story out there. There is something. There's a kernel of truth behind it. But then they are sort of almost encouraged to, paint a much larger picture for the audience in order to get the ratings in. How does one stop that? I mean, today we're living in a neoliberal world where it's all about the money and it's all about ratings and it's all about that sort of competitive urge. If it bleeds, it leads. You move forward with whatever you've got. It doesn't matter what sort of internal policing there may or may not be within the organization. If the organization's bottom line is what matters, that drives the story, doesn't it?
Well, you say, how do you stop it? I question whether you can stop it. Right. I think all you can do is just enable the public to have greater literacy and understanding of the way the media operate and be aware of some of these influences that are brought to bear on the way they do their business. And essentially, just try and encourage, better critical thinking, healthy skepticism, and just for them to be some public debate and response in order to try to keep these sort of things in check. But I mean, as we're seeing with the way that social media responds to mainstream media, that may be happening to a point, but it's certainly not happening in a productive or meaningful way.
See, I wonder what we're going to see next is a move from the credible organisation to the credible person.
Yes.
Rather than developing. And I'll let you, go next on this, Pete, because you can add to my very limited idea I've just come up with that it's going to come down to, I don't know if I trust the organisation, but that person always seems credible to me. That's where I think it's going to go. Yeah,
where it already has done. You have a development of individuals who are trusted individuals. In the UK, Jeremy Paxman, although he's not at the forefront as much as he used to be, trusted individual. John Humphreys on BBC Radio 4. These are people who, are seen as figures of integrity. To take what Sharon was saying, there's always been a pressure on this gilding the lily, because what will happen is somebody will want that picture that will bring home the pathos. So there was a celebrated case when a plane crashed on the side of the M1 where a journalist had gone to a local toy shop and bought some teddy bears and strewn those in the wreckage because there were meant to be some children on the flight. And that made a very good picture. Lots of journalists have been caught out like that. One of the most celebrated ones, and one who I work with, was Jack Kelly for USA Today, who was a war correspondent, and he was found out to have made up huge amounts of stories and essentially have written them in such a way that they would have engaged. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, but he is now utterly disgraced. And that's the sanction. To pick up on another point, oddly, this practice has begun to lessen a little precisely because of the internet, because people doing those bad things. Citizen journalism does find them out in a sense, because there will be other pictures, or maybe even the picture of the journalist strewing the teddy bears through the wreckage. It becomes much, much more dangerous because of the internet and the potential for somebody to take a picture. But often what will happen is that someone will suggest a story to a news desk. The news desk will say, right, that's the story we want you to get. And it's not a question of what is the truth. That's the story that will sell the newspaper.
Hearing your comparison between old media and new media, it seems as if the motivation for journalists to skew or make up stories was for career purposes, whereas I think what we're trying to assess in perhaps the new media is that people are saying things to sway a population in any kind of direction. I think your assessment of the rumor mill of citizen journalism, of anyone taking a picture, it seems to me that it can perform like a fact checking, that as these stories filter through so many people, you have everyone assessing whether that is true or not, and so by the end that of the 20,000 tweets or whatever it is about a certain story, if you've got someone actually checking that in that process, you're filtering it through. Yeah, so I think in some respect that is actually performing a service in terms of every citizen.
If that does happen, the problem is that people tend to want to believe the good story as well, because that's the reason why a skilled news editor gets their job, because they're the one who is there to test the appetite of the reader. So in the same way, sometimes with the social media rumours that start up, then that doesn't necessarily become as useful a mechanism. It's just for when individuals, journalists particularly, are involved in this sort of process, then there is quite an appetite to find them out. Journalists are particularly hated at the moment. I wanted to actually add that there is another celebrated journalist who was sacked, who is a master of manipulation of news, and his name is Boris Johnson, and he's likely to become the next leader of the Conservative Party. He was sacked from the Times for making up stories. He then became a Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph and continued to make up stories, but the people back home liked those stories, so he didn't get sacked that time. But, it's interesting that a court case has been levelled against Boris Johnson today for what is considered to be disinformation that he sowed during the UK Brexit campaign.
In that case, are we trying to, a clear comparison seems to be along with Trump, who, some 3,000, I think, claims in his election campaign that turned out not to be true or were false. I've heard the assessment. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but Henry G. Frankfurt wrote a little treatise on bullshit, it's called, where this is the way he would assess Trump, is that he wasn't lying. He wasn't saying those things when he knew the truth. He just didn't care about the truth. He was only trying to persuade his audience. And would you say the same thing of Boris Johnson?
I think that my personal view is that Boris Johnson wishes to achieve what he wants to achieve, and so therefore his grasp on the truth might not be quite what it should be. With Donald Trump, I feel that Donald Trump actually does believe that he might be telling the truth. I think he believes what a lot of other people might think is a distorted view of the world, but that's his world, and I think that's the big issue that we're all having to face now, because one of the interesting things that Donald Trump does is he attacks trusted sources of news, and that is an enormously dangerous thing to do, and it's very, very irresponsible. So he says that the New York Times is not a trustworthy source. He says CNN is not a trustworthy source. He also says that the BBC is not a trustworthy source, and nor is The Guardian. Now, I think it's enormously dangerous when, it's one thing for a politician like Boris Johnson to disseminate a view of facts that might not be absolutely accurate. It's another thing when a very, very senior politician, the most senior politician in the world, attacks the veracity of news sources. I think we're in a lot of trouble when that happens.
I think we also, though, need to consider, what is the actual purpose of the media? Because one assumption that we're making in terms of the discussion we're having here is that the media is still dedicated to some kind of truth and truth finding. Whereas I would argue that, media platforms, particularly the way that they've developed in a technological sense, have become more about being heard and having a voice, giving a voice and hearing others' voices. And I think the minute that we start to explore that in more detail, that may also assist us in terms of seeking to understand, why there has been this breakdown in terms of veracity, credibility, and knowing where to go to find the information that we can then deem as universally being considered to be accurate and reliable.
It's interesting. We talk about the technological platforms that have enabled the growth in social media, and arguably it also has contributed to mainstream media being either on the nose or declining as a force. But there's another factor at stake here: the consolidation of mainstream media, which has allowed whoever's left in that domain to dominate global news in the way that they couldn't, say, 20 years ago. So there's a consolidation of power, and that consolidation, that monopolistic tendency of the mainstream media, what has that done in order to see the evolution of mainstream media today? Has it either helped or hindered the average news consumer?
You're seeing centralisation is the internet buzzword that is used to describe this. you're seeing the Guardian suddenly becoming a US newspaper. Does that help or does it hinder? Where it helps is it then becomes a voice for a particular strand of opinion, and I think Sharon will agree with me there that people tend to go to news platforms not necessarily for news, but for news that reflects their opinions. And I think that, that was a process that we saw in the dying days of old media. In terms of new media and in terms of social media, what you're seeing now is people going into bubbles where they're getting their opinions sent back to them, but or reinforced, but that tends to be within their Facebook groups of their mates. I mean, one of the areas where there is most concern and where a lot of effort is now being put in is local news, because that's where we've seen the major casualties. We've seen local newspapers and sort of city newspapers suffering hugely. Because they've been suffering hugely, then that means that the corruption that in local government that they used to routinely root out, that stopped. But one of the things that's really interesting in terms of that local news thing is the Nieman Lab, which is at MIT. They've got a newsletter called Today in the Future of News. And one of the things that they pointed out is that levels of gullibility for fake news correlate to areas where there are no local newspapers. So this fact-checking or this need for veracity I think it's more, and I hope that Sharon will agree with me on this, it's more to do with accountability. If you are a producer of news and you have accountability in that sense, then that does produce something of an anchor on you.
Indeed. Yeah, Pete, I entirely agree with you. And in fact, I saw that Nieman study you just referred to, was that published relatively recently? Because I remember seeing something myself just in the last 2 weeks about that correlation with a lack of local news and gullibility. So I remember seeing something about that myself, whether that was the same study or there's another one that supported it. But I suppose the other thing I wanted to just bring in off the back of what you were just talking about there, I mean, you mentioned The Guardian. I'll just be completely upfront here. I'm a Guardian reader, so is my husband. We love the app. That's the way that we read the newspaper every day, pretty much. But I think what's important with something like The Guardian, as an example of mainstream media, is it's always been transparent about its politics. And I think that was what we had years ago and still do have with many of the mainstream outlets, that they are transparent about where their political leanings lie. The problem we have with the proliferation of social media and the bouncing up of all these new platforms and new other ways of branded journalism, which are funded by large organisations or agendas, or indeed, bloggers who are influential, is that they are not transparent about what their agenda is, what they're putting out there in the public domain, and then it's much harder for the public to be able to discern whether they are trustworthy in terms of everything they're disseminating or not. And I think it's that lack of transparency that we need to be looking at.
Could I add something to that just quickly? That seems a very sensible place to start, the idea that we know, for example, we're here in Australia, that The Australian is always going to be a very conservative newspaper. But part of, I think, what we're seeing now is where so many people are jack of either side of politics, that therefore makes them also jack of either obvious source of information. So they actively go hunting in the weeds for the social media that reflects their level of frustration. When people believed in the major political ideas, you could line up with what suited you and there would still be the veracity, because that's what journalism tried to achieve for a long time. But now we see so much rejection of either side of politics in favour of how can I demonstrate my disenfranchisement or my desire for a radical alternative.
I'd also argue it's not just about disenfranchisement with politics. I would also argue that it's part of that that discussion we were having earlier about individuals wanting to have a voice, because for so long information was kept, there was a close hold, there were custodians of news, and for the individual man or woman in the street, they did not feel that their voices were being heard. And it's interesting because we're seeing a similar discussion happening in the area of history and memory studies, in that, I mean, there's been this explosion in the last 30 years of something called the memory industry. And we've seen memory studies now as a university subject of study, where you have, discrete communities saying there's been these grand narratives that have prevailed regarding what is supposed to be my experience of my culture, my history, what's happened in my country or my community for the last 100 years. The fact is that I, my family, my ancestors, we do not remember it in that way. And our memories have as much validity as that grand narrative. And then what's come out of that then is a proliferation of new ways of understanding history. And I see what's happening in social media around news as being a reflection of that same development. So I think what we're seeing here is a movement towards the individual feeling empowered, feeling righteous, feeling they have a right and a genuine need to be heard. And that it's through that proliferation of those individual voices that we're now getting, a cacophony, which is not necessarily making sense, but those individuals feel somehow validated in having that platform and that opportunity to get their version of the news out there.
That's really interesting, because years ago, reading Edward Said's reading on the idea of block narratives. So here we have a Palestinian doing well in America saying, well, the Palestinians are on the wrong side of writing history. So getting their block narrative out. Now, he meant it for a way for a whole people to get it out. But in a sense, by writing the idea that those who win get to write the narrative, therefore there's all these block narratives, it's almost the block narrative has proliferated to the level of the individual. So now we have millions of block narratives that people want to be heard about their individual take, not even their community take.
Because I felt very uncomfortable, to be honest with you, when I worked on staff at the BBC in London, in that the people that I worked among, I came from a working class background. And I felt that many of the people that I was working with at that time had no idea about the kinds of issues and concerns that certainly the family that I came from held. And I felt that there was definitely a tendency to see news in terms of particular issues and particular ways of seeing the world that accorded with what the people around me felt was right in terms of their level of education and where they came from. There was a lack of diversity. There was a lack of certainly of representation of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And although there's been and I'm sure Pete would agree with me, there's been a deliberate attempt over the last 20 years to address that, particularly in the British media establishment. But the problem you have is that there is still, I think, this sense of people feeling that there has been a group of privileged elite who've held on to information dominance for so long, and they are now wanting to be heard. And it's through social media they feel they have that opportunity.
Well, I think that actually, just in the light of something that happened today, where the Daily Telegraph has come out with an assault on Oxford University, because Oxford University has a quota to take in people from poorer backgrounds and people who don't have the same, haven't managed to get the same academic qualifications. And there's been, an attack by that privileged elite, as Sharon's called it, on that, and saying that's not fair. Well, I actually think it is. I also have to point out quickly that I used to write for The Guardian as well, so I'm a bit mitigated in as much as Sharon is. But, this point about, again, it's an internet process. It's called democratization. Yeah, it's valid for people to actually put out that information. The issue comes, I think, again, it goes back to something else that we were talking about at the beginning, which is it's the difference between breaking news and investigative news interpretations of it. And a second point that I wanted to make was, again, endorsing what Sharon's saying, is this new populism is seen as a expression of people who haven't felt represented before because they felt that there's been a stitch-up between political parties, established organisations and an establishment media, and they think that this gives them a voice. And I think that, these are all valid things. It's just the balance that needs to be found about what is truth and what isn't.
Discussing fake news today on Strategicon, of course, not something that we would put out there ourselves, but simply discussing when others partake in fake news. We're going to head to a music break now. Today we have a very special artist made up of high school students in South Australia. Mum Thinks Blue is a 6-piece band with 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, forming a funk indie fusion rock that will impress you and get you grooving. We'll head over to their single, Gotten Away. You can of course find Mum Thinks Blue on Facebook, Spotify and Instagram. Mum Thinks Blue with Gotten Away. You can show your support with this amazing band by following them on Instagram and Facebook, and of course checking out their music on Spotify. We'll head back now to our discussions of fake news, of course not giving you fake news, but discussing the ramifications of those who partake in fake news. We have Dr Sharon Mascall-Dare and Peter Warren in the studio with us.
Could we jump back a couple of centuries to when printing presses became widely available, and through most of the revolutions around the world from sort of 1750 onwards, we see the pamphleteers, people having their 1 or 2 page manifesto and literally printing off the copies and either handing them out or selling them from a few cents. Can we learn any lessons from that era? And is that something as trained journalists you've both learned anything about? I'm sort of dimly aware of it in my head, studying the French Revolution in first year history. And it just seems important that maybe what we've got is new to a degree, but also there's good historical precedents for what happens when there's suddenly a mass of new information of individuals being able to make their case far more affordably and far more broadly.
Trouble is, if we look back in history in terms of, what's been the counterbalance to that sudden explosion of expression and of people being able to have their 5 minutes of fame, whether it be through a pamphlet published, as you say, back in the 17th century, or indeed, it would have been later than that, would have been the 19th century, or indeed with social media posts today. The counterbalance has been, a grouping up of that, largely through what I would argue are these hegemonic influences, where you've had, a particular individual in a position of power or an organisation saying, well, no, actually, it's not okay. Let's group this up. Let's actually make it clear that there's been all this kind of information put out there. Well, no, actually, everybody, you now need to listen to us because we're the voice of truth, and we can now sort of redirect you to something which is closer to how you should understand these facts. Now, I think the discussion we're having here is none of us accept that as being valid. So I think what we're needing is some kind of disruptive influence, in the same way we're seeing disruption in technology, disruption in all other kind of realms of public life. What is the disruptive influence going to be in the media that's going to enable us to find a way out of this mess? Because I would argue that it is a mess right now.
I'd say it's the credibility of podcasters, our best hope at the moment.
Shameless.
But I pay no attention to conventional news for anything other than like weekly deep news where someone writes several thousand words. Other than that, I go, okay, something blew up. I better go read about it. But that's a difficult process now because I don't trust the majority of sources for anything more than basic facts. I want someone who's an expert, who's an enthusiast, 2 days later to spend 40 minutes explaining it. Then I'll learn about it.
I can tell you right now, though, the problem that you have as a journalist, if you subscribed, and I'm sure Pete would agree with me, if you're freelance and you want to go down that path of doing long-form journalism, immersing yourself in subject matter and trying to really get, the facts straight, get it out to the public and do so in a way that's meaningful and engaging, there is no money in it.
No,
because believe me, I
no
tried to do that for 10
Yep.
years.
Yeah.
And frankly, I just could not, after 10 years, much as I loved every minute of some of the investigations I worked on, fact is I would spend heart and soul, 3 months on a project and then get paid, $3,000 from the BBC, and that was it.
Yeah.
You had a point earlier that perhaps the BBC where you were working was not in touch with working class families in terms of what issues they wanted to hear. I think that was the point that you raised earlier. And it seems to me like that people are going to assess their news sources on perhaps two qualities. And one would be its trustworthiness or integrity, perhaps. And then the other one would be its sharing and values. And so people are going to sway either side of whatever, left or right or whatever it is in terms of their source about whether that shares values. I think the left side, let's say, of journalism, the more left-leaning news sources, perhaps like The Guardian, I think even probably professes itself to kind of be that center-left source, obviously does quite a good job at being having integrity, but perhaps on the other side, you've either got the Murdoch press, or you can go as far as someone like Alex Jones, which is a much more sinister type of news, where you've got Holocaust denying or whatever it is. But the point is that people are listening to it because they've decided that Trump has destroyed all of these news sources as being not trustworthy, so they just have to look out into the world and assess what can I listen to, who can I listen to on the basis of sharing my values. Perhaps that's why we're kind of in that problem where people are just not being informed or not fact checking, because it's the idea of having a credible news source perhaps on the right is gone.
I'll be a little bit more basic than that. Most of the people out there, they're punters who take in the news, the customers for news. A lot of them, they've got families, they're working, maybe 2 jobs, 3 jobs, just to make ends meet. They come home, they want to switch on the TV or they go on the web. They want to see whatever they need to see. They'll absorb it at a very superficial level, and they'll be quite comfortable with whatever knowledge or information they have without needing to interrogate it. And this is really where the power of the media comes in, and yet the disempowerment of the people, if I can put it to you this way, also comes in. The people will never be able to get the inside knowledge on a particular issue. They want something called the objective truth. They require the objective truth in order for them to make a judgment as to whether or not to either vote one way or support something that may, affect the national interest in some way or other. But at the moment, there is no such thing. We've got monopolistic tendencies at the big end of town with the CNNs, the BBCs, and the large entities, the large mega corporations out there who control the news at one end. Then you've got this fractured mess called social media at the other. And then you've got in between the people who are dependent on trying to navigate their way either from one source or the other. It is a very difficult situation.
I'm not sure that I'm really not sure that it is a problem with the two-speed news cycle, right? You've like the breaking news and the long form. I think it is more a problem that the people who are disseminating this information aren't so worried about whether what they're saying is true. It's how much can they get away with. It's not necessarily a consideration.
How powerful and important and persuasive can they be?
Yeah,
you have to be trained or want to be objective. And if people aren't trained to or don't want to be objective, if persuasion is the game, so the real problem here is two different games. Objectivity or power. Which game are you in? And which game do you
power
want to be
wins
in?
all the time, though, David, because
you can train enough people.
If you sit down and you compare, say, some blogger or some, dare I say, podcaster or someone out there in the community, they will never be able to have the kind of credibility as a CNN has. Because, they can, CNN is a mega corporation. They can throw umpteen resources to journalists all over the world. They've got their little networks. They've got their insiders. They can go off and do stuff. And then, of course, if I come home after a hard day's work and I switch on the TV, I will switch on the TV looking at CNN, knowing full well that I'm getting as good a picture as I possibly can as someone who would otherwise find the world way, way too complex.
Yeah, but they're going to look at CNN because they're going to buy into the world view of progressive and reasonably objective.
I would argue, though, David, we need to really pull apart this notion of objectivity being achievable. I don't want to sound like a cliche.
More objective then rather than objectivity.
Because I would say the problem that we have, and this has been documented through, scholarship around journalism for the last 30 years, is that the notion of objectivity as we would like to believe it exists has been discredited.
Yeah, but it's like marking at uni. That's not objective either, but we keep using the word.
Oh dear.
And even if we think we have objective facts, I mean, I actually saw a fantastic, in fact, Pete would have seen this as well. There was a debate that was on Question Time, I think it was last week in the UK, where one of the MPs said to Nigel Farage, Nigel, you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. And I just thought that was classic. But the thing is even if we think we have objective facts, the problem we then have is how those are framed within a news report still puts a spin on them. So, I mean, if we go down this path of objectivity, I would argue that we're going to get to a dead end.
All right, Sharon.
Well, could we change it to then the difference between persuading or presenting?
I think that there's something very interesting here because there's definitely two movements that are happening in terms of this thing about objectivity. I mean, to pick up on something Sharon said, the truth and your version of the truth is always going to be pretty subjective. This notion that you should support quality news journalism, I think that there are potentially a lot of pitfalls in that, because a lot of conventional newspapers will say, hang on, actually, this should be on the basis of success. But then, as Sharon says, that's the news slant that you're putting on something and the appeal that your news editors feel that may have for your readers. And so, because one of the things that all of this comes down to for all news organisations is news is a business. And so the numbers become very, very important. The Sun newspaper here has a pass-on circulation of around, it's about 5 million all told read the Sun. And the Sun is many people in the UK would say that is not the most trustworthy source. That there are issues with the way that the Sun slants its news stories. And so, what is its objectivity? So there is this move to generate some sort of almost pure journalism. But and that then comes down to this. There's another issue here too, which is that thing of journalism talking truth to power. of saying the things that people don't want heard. And there's another factor that I want to introduce into this, which is your fellow Australian Julian Assange. He created a bit of a revolution by attacking that establishment attempt to hold onto information as power. He went in, got hold of all of the documents, threw them out willy-nilly. And, that was fact, because those were the documents that people had been swapping backwards and forwards. So that's another new element of perhaps this objective journalism, perhaps this breaking open of this old establishment view. So to actually begin to stress that objectivity in the face of all of these competing thoughts, and to be able to come out with something that people will say, yes, we're going to trust that. That's the issue. That's the challenge. That's what journalism has to face at the moment.
There's also one other issue, obviously, Peter. There's the relationship between the media moguls and the politicians, right? Is this a healthy relationship? I mean, how does this relationship make mainstream media groups, sound? Is it more like propaganda? When you've got people like Rupert Murdoch, good old Adelaide boy as he is. Sorry, I had to have a plug for South Australia somewhere. But anyway, good old Adelaide boy as he is, he's very close to the centre of many national centres of power. And so therefore, when you can peddle that sort of influence, what can be expected from the media outlet concerned? I mean, it's going to have a political view, a strategic political view, that it will reflect the dominant themes of national capitals, as opposed to looking objectively at a particular situation, whether it be the current tensions in the Gulf or any other political controversy, Brexit, for instance. There will be these kind of very subjective points at a strategic level, which undermines a lot of things in terms of finding that magic chalice of objectivity.
I think, look, there's always been a very uneasy relationship between, or unhealthy relationship between politicians and journalists. I've always maintained that journalism is a poor sister to politics. They have a symbiotic relationship. One of the you look at the Sunday Times, for example. The Sunday Times used to employ Annabel Heseltine. Annabel Heseltine was the daughter of Lord Heseltine. Therefore, she knew, or the Sunday Times knew, that if Annabel rang up her dad, then she would be able to get some very good insight into what was going on. Margaret Thatcher's daughter, Carol Thatcher, was employed by the Daily Telegraph. Petronella Wyatt was Woodrow Wyatt's daughter. Woodrow Wyatt was a columnist for the News of the World. He was also one of Thatcher's best friends. So being on the coalface is good journalism, but of course it also makes you a hostage to fortune as well, insofar as, you're going to get the information that they want to give you. You're also, Annabel Heseltine no longer works for the Sunday Times. Carol Thatcher no longer works for the Daily Telegraph. You go when your political
capital is over.
Patronage goes, yeah. So I think that's the issue, and also to sort of go back to something that Sharon was saying, that Nigel Farage, he isn't liked by the political establishment. He doesn't like journalists. He's got an ongoing war with journalists over everything. He says that our current system is corrupt and it's broken, and the way to fix it is to open the floodgates to the good old common man, the working man, which is, again, then I go back to something David said. Well, David said that he reads these long-form pieces to get his view of the world. Well, then that goes to something that John says. How many people have the time to do that? There is a dissatisfaction with intellectuals that's going on at the moment, which underpins a lot of what's going on, because to take Sharon's point, it's seen as this establishment's been holding power for so long and holding on to information, and now there's a liberation of information.
Tim made the question about Donald Trump earlier, and I'd like to actually, following on from what you've just said, Peter, just continue with that thought bubble. So following on from this, the more sensationalist or salacious a political figure, the more airtime he or she seems to generate these days. What role has a less critical media meant in terms of changing the behavioural dynamics of political leaders? Is this just a Trump thing, or will Trump leave us with a legacy of badly behaved, crude political leaders?
I really hope not.
Me too,
I really hope not. But I mean, I've just been flabbergasted though. I mean, I don't want to sound like some kind of grumpy old school teacher type figure, but I mean, if you look at just the state of debate that we've seen, particularly during Brexit. I mean, Pete, I used to be a European affairs correspondent years ago, and for my sins, I remember being this kind of lone voice at the BBC, trying to kind of, get them to not only tell negative stories about the EU, but also put some of the kind of positive stuff that was going on. And you'd remember that time back in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, it was very much a polarising debate, but at least there was still a debate. It was still a discussion where people were civil to each other. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, I mean, I've just been absolutely appalled at how the quality of discussion has collapsed and turned into, attacks on individuals, a lack of proper argument, lack of evidence. I mean, I'm surprised by what's happened over there, Pete. And I'm really interested to know a bit more about what you've experienced as a result of working the thick of that over the last couple of years.
Well, you know that sensationalist politicians make headlines. You know that politicians being offensive or being controversial makes headlines. So in a world which is so polarised now, because you've got 50% of the population who want Brexit, 50% of the population who don't, and I think that that's an accurate figure, because I think that the opinions have changed a little over the last 2 years. That means that with that polarity, you get what's essentially a whipping up of the mob. And with both sides becoming, very, very upset. A good case was yesterday. Marc Francois, who is the deputy leader of the Europe Reform Group in the European Research Group, he was incredibly rude to Theresa May in a way that I found actually myself quite offensive. So I think that it's the new populism, and it's the new populism which some people are personifying as right-wing. I don't think that that's fair, because I think that you're seeing it on both sides of the divide. I actually think that what this is information warfare, because one of the things that I think is even more interesting in all of this is the role of countries, of nation states like Russia. There's evidence, for example, that Russian bots or bots from somewhere that people don't know of have already been were interfering, still are interfering in the European debate. They're presumably still interfering in the Brexit debate. When you've got people who are already polarised, it's very, very easy to inflame them even further. So I think you said it's a mess. I think it's a mess. I think that this is something that regulation needs to occur. And I think that regulation needs to occur on the social media companies. If a social media company is capable of working out how much money it can get from the adverts on its pages, and it knows when those adverts are changing, then it means that it has the capacity to be able to monitor what's going on in the social media. It doesn't choose to, because it's making money from the adverts. It's not making money from the monitoring. So, and that is the change. The change is social media. Let's not have any illusions about this. It has been that democratization, which, yes, is useful. And yes, we should embrace it. But at the same time, It's the social media that is creating the cacophony of noise. It's creating the bear pit that we're seeing. And it's pretty evident that that is the thing that needs to be reined in. I think one very, very interesting point that a lot of people have missed because here, as you asked me to talk about Brexit, you don't see anything but Brexit, and a lot of things that are important get missed. For example, the European Union passed legislation only about a month or so ago that said that all terrorist material had to be taken down in 24 hours. No, I think in an hour. And I said this, I think, in the last podcast that I was on, that in Germany there is a hefty fine of hundreds of thousands of euros if content isn't taken down by the social media companies. Let's be under no illusions that it's social media that's fanning the flames. And the politicians are very well aware of that. They've all got Twitter accounts. They've all got Facebook accounts, and they know that this is a direct way of reaching out to the people who are their supporters.
Pete, I want to ask you, I've recently read your article, The Extended Mind. Do you think that there's a possibility of having some kind of objectivity when the gathering of news is actually done by algorithms, when we can actually have an objective recount of events like you were talking about in your article, and then actually produce journalism with that? That seems to me like perhaps even a positive outcome of what was mostly a frightening account of what's about to happen.
There are already AIs that are doing journalistic tasks. There was some interesting research that came out again in the last 5 days that said that, it was in the last 5 days. It was reported by somebody in Parliament today, saying that most of the people who work in AI are extremely worried about the ramifications of AI. I was pondering whether I would prefer to be tried by an AI judge or some of the judges that I have been up before for things in my journalistic career. I actually thought that an AI judge, I would have more faith in its objectivity, in quotation marks. In terms of AI journalism, look, I think the thing with journalism is fine, so long as you can say, these are the facts. As the founding editor of The Guardian said, facts are sacred, opinions free.
That was hilarious.
So long as you've got those facts, and you've presented them, you've presented, this is well researched, its veracity, then I think that you're okay with conventional journalism. If you are going to say, I'm going to have an AI journalist, then it comes down to how much you trust the programmers who came up with the AI. It comes up with the sources that the AI is using. And let's face it, at the moment, many of the AIs, many of the chatbots have come up with some rather unsettling responses, such as the Microsoft one, which had to be disabled because it suddenly became racist. Yes, if you are going to have an AI journalist, if you wanted to have an AI source of veracity, then you're going to have transparency over its programming and over its data inputs, and you're going to need to know how it came to the decisions that it came to. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I think it's a possibility. I think it's more of a possibility because all of the work that we've done on AI would appear to suggest that AIs will augment what people are doing rather than actually be the overriding decision maker. And I think that's something that David was thinking about.
Yeah, well, again, we were going to talk about artificial intelligence versus intelligent augmentation at some point in the future, but it seems just as relevant to this. In the end, you imagine we will have some sort of, AI working on our phone to go, well, actually, I've looked at 4,000 things for you, and these 2,000 are just speculation or opinion. These seem to have common facts but different arguments, and here are the major different arguments being put forward on top of what seem like equivalent facts.
I think, David, that you're absolutely right there, that you'll have an AI on your phone that will go out and say, there's a lot of sites that people seem to be going to. They're rubbish. These ones seem to know what they're talking about.
I'm just actually really uncomfortable with the idea of AI starting to kind of meddle in the business of journalism. I had a conversation with actually someone who's based in Adelaide, Professor Fiona Kerr, a few months back. She's a very interesting lady. Her research is around AI, but has focused primarily on the importance of eye gaze as a means of basic human contact, human engagement, a means for fact checking, for veracity. But her research has taken something which we might regard as relatively simple, the idea that if you look into someone's eyes and you actually lock that gaze, she's tracked neurologically all kinds of patterns that then emerge in the brain around what that then means for cognition and understanding and all the rest of it. But she's taken her research one step further and then starting to look at these questions. Do you want a robot to hold your hand when you die? What about the healthcare space? And indeed, what about the journalistic space? And I just feel strongly that if we lose that human element in journalistic practice, I just think we'll be all the poorer for it. I'm really uncomfortable about turning journalism into something which computers are capable of doing without human, direct involvement.
Okay, then, Sharon, in terms of a solution then to much of this, then what do you think the solution is? Because Reporters Without Borders was suggesting that there should be a system to point, i.e. give points on the basis of how true the material is on a particular website. They rode away from that idea. They were actually going to roll it out as an app because they realised that then people would accuse them of bias or whatever. I mean, what do you think is the solution?
Well, I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I think it's I'm actually looking at the way that the history and memory movements are trying to reconcile their differences. And I'm wondering if there's something we can learn from that. In that essentially there's a German-based academic called Aleda Assmann who's done a lot of work around trying to argue that in order for memory and history to be able to live alongside each other and to essentially drive together towards some kind of form of truth or something which is more reliable for the public to relate to and understand, that there needs to be greater interaction. There needs to be, rather than a polarization in terms of the grand narrative and the individual narrative, or indeed if we want to use that as a metaphor for the media environment, between the mainstream news outlets and then the individuals on social media, that there does need to be some kind of way for them to hold each other to account through checks and balances, some kind of verification mechanism, whether that's done with the aid of technology. That's certainly, I'm not uncomfortable with that. I'm just uncomfortable with the kind of AI sort of idea of that sort of taking over journalistic practice. As a verification tool, I can certainly see potential, but I suppose I'm just looking for some kind of just disruptive influence to come in here. I'm looking for what's going to be, in the same way that Uber has disrupted, transport, in the same way that Airbnb has disrupted the hotel industry. What is going to be that disruptive influence that's going to come into the media that's going to help us to find a way out of this, which is something that's meaningful and where we can actually, work towards some kind of solution?
Look, guys, we have unfortunately run out of time. We've covered a lot of ground, and there certainly were some huge issues discussed today. So first and foremost, let me thank both Sharon and Peter for appearing on this episode of Strategicon. I had one final question, but I think that I will have to reserve the right to ask that question at another time, and it would have been aimed at Tim because he's a young journalism student, but nonetheless, let's put a hold on that one for now. Anyway, thanks again for joining us on Strategicon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Up to $26,000 per employee? They call it the 15-minute refund, but it's not a gimmick. It's for business owners who stuck it out during the pandemic. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, or ERTC. But time is running out to get started. Talk to the experts. JWC Advisors at iHeartTaxRefunds.com. Who are they? CPAs who will keep you on the right side of the IRS. So do it the right way. Go to iHeartTaxRefunds.com. That's iHeartTaxRefunds.com.